Hi, just to give you a little bit of background about myself. I've marched against Section 28. I've stood tall and proud as an unapologetic trans woman, demanding rights, dignity and properly funded services for trans people. But I've also demonstrated in defence of women's abortion rights, their right to control their own bodies, definitions, spaces, and to direct their own fight against sexism. Scandalously for that, I've been accused of allying with bigotry and the far right. I'll take no lectures on fighting bigotry or the right wing from those trans activists happy to demonise progressive women who dare to have an opinion which differs from their own. Throughout my adult life, I've fought the right, both in terms of trying to articulate a vision of hope and solidarity over division and bigotry, but also directly on demonstrations and in working for fighting trade unions and for Labour governments. Time and again, I've opposed the far right in Halifax, in Leeds, several times in London, including the massive Welling demonstration in 1993. The fact that I'm opposed to both the proposals for self-registration, self-recognition of gender identity, and the current transgender ideology that is, I'm sad to say, seems to be accepted by the majority, certainly of the trans activists, is entirely consistent with all that activism, precisely because I think that these proposals and this underlying ideology is bad for women, bad for gay people who are homosexuals, not homogenderals. And it also plays directly into the hands of the right wing. I think ultimately it's also bad for trans people, and particularly transsexuals like myself. I say transsexual because it's a term that we're not supposed to use anymore. But it actually describes people who, for the most part, undergo or wish to undergo a gender reassignment surgery and have hormone treatment to complete what I would describe as a meaningful medical transition, a largely irreversible commitment that not only helps us to fit into an opposite sex social reality, which is more than just stereotypes, because women are also active agents who shape their world. So it's not just the imposed social world, it's also the world that women create through their own endeavour and action. But I'd also argue it goes some way to, that transition, a meaningful transition, goes some way to putting many women at greater ease of having male-born people in their spaces. In the public imagination, certainly, this is what people think of when you talk about someone who is trans. It was never wholly true. Not all transsexuals could or did have reassignment surgery, but certainly now, with the advent of the broader category of transgenderism, it's less true now than ever before. So the far more nebulous words transgender and trans woman have come to dominate in a movement that's expanded its definition of trans to include full-time and part-time cross-dressing men, non-binary people, gender fluid people who one day identify as female, another day identify as male, and in fact any gender non-conforming people. So for instance, it includes people like Alex Drummond, who identifies as a woman but proudly sports a full beard. It also includes men who sexually fetishize women's clothes, often copying pornified versions of femininity to satisfy their needs. Now, people don't want to face up to that, but that is a reality. There is a portion of people who call themselves trans women who will no doubt claim rights that they believe are according to that, who do sexually fetishize women's clothes. Many people from these different groups will call themselves trans women, as Eddie Izzard now does. having previously asserted he was a male transvestite. And, frankly, was widely admired for it. I thought it was a very courageous thing, which I totally supported. I completely support Eddie being able to dress and act how he likes. I'd happily address him how he wants to be addressed, defend him from discrimination, his right to safety and dignity. But he's not a woman, and neither am I. And he doesn't have the right to be on all women's shortlists designed to overcome the disadvantages of being female and the underrepresentation of women. What many, probably most of these people have in common, apart from coming under the trans umbrella, is that they will proudly retain their penis. And many will not even have hormone treatment. And this is reinforced by a trans ideology that insists that trans identity is something that's fixed and innate and confers womanhood on anyone who says they have this identity. So according to this theory, if you identify as a woman, you are one and always have been. Therefore, no physical changes are necessary. And a penis on a trans woman becomes, in this thinking, a female organ. So Gendered Intelligence, for example, an organisation that advises schools on trans issues, declares in their sexual health guide for young people that a woman is still a woman even if she enjoys getting blowjobs. This kind of thinking is why lesbians are being accused of transphobic bigotry for refusing to accept that a trans woman with a penis is a potential sexual partner for them. Clearly, all this has a bearing on the views of many women about the rights of trans women to access women's private single-sex spaces. Why should lesbians, attracted by definition to members of the same sex, have their sexuality demeaned and be abused in coercive attempts to persuade them that their natural attractions are somehow wrong and transphobic? To my mind, that is a kind of homophobia. In a different vein, why should some of the most vulnerable women in our society, victims of sexual and violent abuse at the hands of males, have to share their most intimate and vulnerable spaces with people born male? They may be alone, undressed, or recently traumatized along with their children, perhaps in a domestic violence shelter, supposedly a place of safety and healing. How can these vulnerable women heal when, quite naturally, they are often triggered, particularly in the immediate aftermath of the violence, by male voices and by people who are obviously male, despite whatever gender identity they may have, as part of a completely normal post-traumatic fear response? That's not bigotry. What's potentially even more problematic, especially with the concept of self-identity making physical changes, even dress, irrelevant, it means someone who looks and presents like a man cannot be challenged if they say they identify as a woman. And it's already making women's boundaries impossible to maintain. And many women fear that predatory men will increasingly take advantage. Lots of women understand all too well the patient planning, dedication, the sheer lengths that some predatory men go to, sometimes over years, to gain access to vulnerable women. Why should women put up with a situation where they're told they are hate groups and bigots for having no faith in the notion that predatory men will not exploit self-identity to access vulnerable women? To many women, the notion that men wouldn't do that is cruelly and laughably naive. We already know some will. Christopher Hambrook, for instance, did precisely that in Canada. He falsely self-identified as a trans woman in order to gain access to a shelter, and was eventually forced to plead guilty to sexual assault and criminal harassment, and admitted that he wasn't, in fact, trans. This brings me to a fundamental point which is glossed over or completely ignored by proponents of self-identity. Why is there no controversy about trans men and men's spaces? I mean, I think there are a number of reasons, and sexism is one of those. But, Are men less bigoted than women? No, of course not. The fundamental reason there's no controversy is that men are not oppressed by or vulnerable to female-bodied or female-born people. The elephant in the room, and why there is so much controversy about access to female spaces, is the systematic oppression of women and girls. Just a minor detail then. Including high levels of violence by men. It's therefore not very reassuring to women to be told by trans activists that their concerns are bigotry, to be subject to a campaign of abuse, harassment, authoritarian and anti-democratic methods to close down meetings that have created a toxic atmosphere of fear. The almost total absence of dissent from the Parliamentary Women's Labour Party speaks volumes, I think. No one has been brave enough to put their head above the parapet to clearly oppose this agenda. Yet we know from journalists it's not for the lack of any concern about these proposals. Instead, it's been left to ordinary trade unionists, socialists and feminists, mainly women, but also increasing numbers of men and transsexuals. To be told there is no debate, and disingenuously that the issue of self-declaration is of no concern to women and does not affect them is insulting. Women's boundaries are being demolished, and they're not even being allowed the opportunity to object without being demonized. No one can object to anyone's private identity. We defend people's right to their own beliefs, to dress, behave, and be how they want to be in regards to gender. But when such identities become social demands that undermine other people's rights and autonomy, then we have a problem. We can respect the right of deeply religious people to believe in God and the Bible, Allah and the Quran, to dress, worship, and practice their religion how they choose, and free from discrimination. But if religious people then demanded that we all agree with their beliefs in God, and that we alter our laws in accordance with the Bible, we would have a real problem. There would be uproar, quite rightly. It's also concerning that for such a small population, there are many trans women who, whilst claiming to be actual women, have been demonstrating behaviour all too often mirroring the coercive and violently threatening behaviour more typical of men. We've seen an assault. We've seen individual women surrounded by mobs shouting abuse, including a woman on her own picket line. We've seen cowards in masks trying to stop women from meeting and talking, bomb threats, and innumerable threats of violence or glorification of violence. We've even seen an exhibition of trans, and I can't get my head around this, trans baseball bats, weapons to use against women they dehumanize as TERFs. There is a sickness in this ideology, and it reeks of narcissistic male rage. Why would women not be concerned about sharing crisis shelters or changing rooms with people who glory in violence against them? Now, that's not by any means all trans people. The majority of trans people are not a threat to women. This is a minority, but it's a very significant minority. There can be no progressive agenda that uses these tactics and tries to intimidate and silence women. And there can be no socialism of any kind that tells women, who the last time I checked were half of the labour movement and half of society, you're to be redefined, all your spaces are to be opened up to people born male. Move over, be quiet, and submit. When did socialists or even just progressive-minded people ever think that was okay? Given that trans people themselves are oppressed as deviants for transgressing the gender role norms which have evolved to oppress women and to prepare boys for work and warfare, There certainly can be no trans liberation without a women's liberation from these norms. A trans movement that collaborates with the gender oppression of women is leading trans people to an enormous backlash. By denying the reality and importance of sex in a sexist world, and by codifying and raising up gender, the very thing which demeans and diminishes women, to be the preeminent social and legal category governing female spaces, political autonomy, representation, the transgender movement is subordinating sex to gender, and therefore the subordination of any women with a shred of independence from their movement. Gender norms that tell women they're weak, passive, frivolous, and valued for their looks more than for what they do in life oppress and keep women in a second-class position in society. And they completely devalue and negate masculine girls, just as the male gender role devalues and often humiliates feminine boys. As long as those gender norms remain, so will women remain second-class citizens, and also trans people will continue to be discriminated against, treated with ridicule and hostility for transgressing those gender norms. We are also a tiny and vulnerable minority. Our interests lie in cultivating solidarity with the women's movement and our shared interest in opposing male violence, in opposing the gender norms that oppress us both, not in demonizing women who disagree. It's not only just not in our interest, it's not even necessary. I've lived, worked, been treated as a woman for 20 years. I'm married to an avowed lesbian, having been together for 10 years. And at no point have I needed to pretend that biological sex is not real. At no point was it ever necessary to deny the unique biology, socialization, and struggles of women. Is there a need for reform? Absolutely. We need a fully funded system that is much more prompt, supportive, and responsive, not demeaning and cumbersome. But we do need a system, and one that women can have confidence in. That's the right thing to do, and it's also the only way to avoid the public support that currently exists for trans people from being undermined. We also need professional clinicians free to do their jobs of diagnosis and of assisting patients to fully understand their underlying feelings and motivations. Far from knowing best, children and young adults who come out as trans often get their identity wrong. Dr. James Cantor has shown repeated studies indicating between 60 and 90% of children who identify as trans stop doing so after puberty, and most of those turn out to be healthy, gay and lesbian young people. Some people who, often after irreversible surgeries, realize that they've been mistaken about their identities and try to detransition, have revealed a number of things that could have been picked up by good clinicians who were free to do their jobs, such as unresolved childhood abuse being the actual main problem, not being transgender, suppressed butch lesbian identity, and other issues such as primary mental health problems. Gender specialists should not be constrained, as they are now, by the fear of being accused of conversion therapy and by the NHS Memorandum of Understanding, which also limits their ability to actually do their job. They can protect some extremely vulnerable young people from making irreversible mistakes, as well as help those who will benefit from treatment. We need to recognise that we can live and be treated broadly how we want to be treated, but we have no right to pretend that the social constructions of gender are more important and more real than the biological foundations of our species. And we have no automatic right to access women's spaces. Instead of witch hunts and demonisation, we need mutual respect and a commitment to debate and resolve these issues as equals. Only in voluntary unity with the women's movement and the wider labour movement can we ensure lasting and meaningful trans rights and the kind of powerful solidarity that can win better resourced services for all, and to take on the establishment forces that propagate the gender norms that oppress women, restrict men, and negate trans people. Whatever you do from here, and whatever your stance is on this debate, I implore you to accept that there is a legitimate debate to be had, and we so very badly need to have it in as progressive and respectful manner as possible. The alternative is a prolonged and increasingly bitter war with women, and in the end, only the right wing, and I actually fear the far right, will profit from those divisions. Thank you.